Aloha, my name is Rachel, and I am an attorney with the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission. And I just wanted to start by thanking just the Maui Economic Development Board and the team with Hawaii Energy Conference to bring this conference to you all and to make it happen during a year when so many other things have been canceled or postponed. So thank you for joining the Develop With Us, Not For Us panel. I am here joined today with Ali Andrews, co-founder of Shake Energy Collaborative, as well as Alvaro Sanchez, Director of Environmental Equity with Greenlining Institute. And what we'll be talking today about is deep diving into what we mean when we talk about community. What does it mean to work with communities, particularly around energy planning and energy planning with equity at the forefront. And so we'd like to start by doing a little bit of sharing on how you do that, which is, we believe, to start to get to know people first. And so if I could ask my panelists to do a little bit of sharing. Alvaro, do you mind sharing your origin story so that we can get to know you a bit better?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Nice to see everybody. My name is Alvaro Sanchez, the Director of Environmental Equity at the Greenlining Institute. And my origin story is that I'm someone who's from Mexico City. I was born there and moved to the US at a very early age. So I'm also an immigrant, and I've lived in immigrant communities all my time in California, which means that I, kind of understand the dynamic of not being able to quite know the circumstances around you, and that being somewhat foreign to you. I'm also from people with strong connections to the land, but I never thought of myself as an environmentalist. And I think that plays a big role in the way that we talk about these issues with communities that are less familiar with environmentalism. I'm from Oakland via Los Angeles, and have been living in Oakland now for the last decade. And I am from a long, rich history of people that don't only want a cleaner future, but we want a more just and equitable one. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to talking to everybody.
Thank you, Alvaro. Wonderful to meet you. Ali, could you share a bit of background about you and your story, please?
Sure. So my name is Ali Andrews. I grew up in Seattle, come from a long line of Seattleites, which made it very radical that at 18 I left Seattle. Haven't spent a lot of time there since, but had the great opportunity to observe a bunch of communities outside of the state. Went to college in Vermont and then moved out to Hawaii in 2011 to work on climate science and climate policy. Then made a switch to California to further my education, studying design in California, where I currently live in the Central Valley, in the San Joaquin Valley in California.
Thank you, Ali and Alvaro. I'll share a little bit about me. There's a dog in the background. Hopefully that doesn't overpower me talking. We'll get that handled in a bit. But I'd like to say that I come from Southern folk. So first and foremost, I'm a daughter. My mom is from a Southern Caribbean island called Trinidad, and my dad is from a Southern state we know as Louisiana. And I grew up with three sisters in a southeastern town in Sierra Vista, Arizona, and have settled here in Hawaii for about the past 13 years. And I feel much at home here, being the southernmost state in the US. I just feel surrounded by Southern folk for the majority of my life. And the work I've been able to do here in Hawaii has involved a number of things, but has really been grounded in communities. So sometimes that's been homeless services, sometimes that's been sustainable community planning, a lot of it grounded in environment and land, but always with the ultimate desire to see people benefit. And I've been able to do that now, most recently as an attorney with the Public Utilities Commission. So now that you've all gotten to know us a little bit better, I'd like to provide a disclaimer. This conversation is condensed. Clearly, we have about 20 minutes left to talk, but the conversation that we will have will likely raise questions that won't be answered in this panel. But that's kind of the point. So we're hoping that these questions are questions that linger with you, things that you ask yourselves, that you ask your colleagues, that you challenge your business leaders, community leaders with, and really dig deeply to find the answers. So we'll start with a question for the audience, actually. Just a little poll so that we have a bit of engagement from you as we progress in this conversation. So if you could tab into the answer of if you currently have an energy generating project, renewable or otherwise, in your neighborhood, and we're talking about within about 5 miles of your home. I believe the audience should be able to see that. We should get a sense of where people are living and what they've got going on in or near their backyards. And there's a pretty hefty number of folks who have an energy generating project in their neighborhood. Okay. Interesting. All right, we'll let that run. People can keep pulling in. I think it might close sooner or later, but it looks like our winner is most people who are attending today and participated in the poll do have an energy generating project in their neighborhood. Okay, so our first question, we talk a lot about community, and I think we mean different things when we say that. And so I'd love for you to share, Ali and Alvaro, when you use the term community, what do you mean? And like, who are you speaking of, especially in the context of renewable energy work? So Alvaro, I'll give it to you to kick off.
Sure, thank you. I mean, for us, community is really the ecosystem that's responsible for making a better world possible. So starting with community first, really important for us to be able to learn from community, to hear their perspective, and come with an open heart, an open mind, and open ears around what their priorities are. I think too often what we see is that folks come with a preconceived notion of what it is that they're going to inform the community about. And instead, I think the approach that we're taking is listening to them first to better get an understanding of where they're coming from and what their priorities are, and then figuring out if anything that we're doing has a point of intersection with what they care about. And most of the time we do find some, but it's not always all of it. So it's really important to start from that perspective because the ecosystem is really important. The government agencies, the utilities, the business groups, the businesses, all of these play a different role in the way that projects take place in community. And everybody has something to contribute, but it's really that ecosystem that we try to cultivate. So for us, community is that ecosystem, but the community, the people that live in the community are really the ones that we emphasize most in our work, because those tend to, one, are going to be the most impacted by whatever happens in their communities, and two, have the most at stake around whether or not these projects are going to be successful. So we emphasize the ecosystem for us.
I appreciate that ecosystem approach. Ali, I know especially in your work in developing, some of the projects that you'll need to submit have some firm requirements. And I think they give you some information about how community is defined. So I wonder if you could share what your experience is with kind of teasing out what we mean when we say community.
Sure. Yes, I think that's a really important question. We often use the word community like 5 times in a sentence and then have to pick apart what did we mean by each individual instance. For us as a developer, we partner with communities, so we're looking for sort of who is going to be our co-creator in this project, and depending on what policy or maybe potentially what funding source we are building under or applying for, that constrains what communities, what geographic areas we can look at partnering in. So for example, in California, there's a policy called Community Solar Green Tariff, where we look to partner with a community group, and that policy is only allowed for what California defines as disadvantaged communities based on a metric called CalEnviro's rate. So that really cuts down the specific census tracts that we can work in, even if another community is interested in partnering with us. We would prefer to go with sort of a self-defined community and the community organization. We think of community largely as sort of a geographic definition for us.
Awesome. I appreciate both of those perspectives, and it brings to mind just some of the historical injustices around how energy projects specifically have been developed, because often they are in communities of color and disadvantaged communities. And so especially before, when we weren't developing as many renewable energy projects, environmental justice was kind of not a thing. Injustice was more the norm, because we would have coal plants and oil burning plants and just a lot of things that were contributing to degradation of the environment in communities where people were living and attempting to thrive and really being thwarted at each effort to do that because of the unhealth in their environments. And so when I think about that, I think a little bit about our previous discussion where we talked about the social contract and that being a thing that has been broken. And I wonder if, Alvaro, I keep choosing you first and I won't always do that. But I wonder if you could tease out some of the ideas that we sometimes gloss over in really acknowledging that there is a social contract in the way that we develop in communities and how that's been broken.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the focus of my work is on this. And I think right now we are seeing the issues more pronounced. COVID-19 really kind of demonstrated all of the inequities that are built into our system. And I think the combination of that with the uprisings also are showing that there is something at the root that creates disproportionate impacts for some populations versus others. My organization has been focusing on the impacts of redlining and how those are showing up today. And one of the things that we've been doing more recently has really been trying to unpack the legacy of racist policies that are not just one-offs, but instead have built on each other to create the kinds of conditions that our communities are facing today. So, you go all the way back to colonization, to slavery. You think about Jim Crow laws, Chinese Exclusion Act, Japanese internment. You're thinking about foreclosure crisis and who was most impacted there. Now you're thinking about COVID. Race has always been an influencer in who is successful and who isn't in this country. And that's really, something that we need to understand when we're coming into community with a fresh new perspective and a fresh new project, that entire legacy can't be undone just by that one new introduction. So yes, sometimes it feels like, well, that was a long time ago. I did not do anything to contribute to that. I'm coming with a new perspective. I'm coming to offer something that's better. But I think it's important for us to understand that that's the impact that people are struggling with every day, and that we need to at least be open to the idea that what we are coming to propose and share needs to be in reference to that long legacy of inequities that have been created. So it's not to say that we should stop and not do anything. And in fact, we need to do more. That's why we need to do equity. But we have to understand where those communities are coming from in order for our message to actually be heard. So the social contract that we believe has been broken is one that wasn't just one contract. It was multiple contracts that have been broken over time, never fully addressed. And now we expect that people should just embrace clean energy projects or otherwise with open arms without addressing the fact that these contracts have been, just gone unaddressed for a really long time. So equity for me is not just about the system of doing something better moving forward. It's about acknowledging the past, understanding the current conditions, and really intentionally addressing those impacts as we move forward. That to me is the equity that we're looking to implement in a lot of the work that we do on clean energy projects.
Your mention of acknowledging, I think is one of the challenging things. Like in this current time, there's kind of broad acknowledgement, but then as people self-reflect and kind of look, not just personally, but like how does who they are as a person and where they occupy their time, like professionally, and what they do in the community, like how are those things impacting the decisions that they're making and the ways in which they go about the world. And so, Ali, I know that some of the things that you've done in your work requires you, well, I think actually you've required yourself, you've put some of the onus on yourself to think deeply and to do that acknowledgement. And I wonder if you could share some of the ways in which you've understand the layers of your learning and how that's transitioned into the work that you're doing today, and just the continued learning process that you undertake to engage with communities meaningfully.
Yes, yeah, I'm so glad that we're having this conversation, because it's definitely something that as a developer, as a new developer, this is a new occupation for me, and I'm learning so much as I come into partnership with communities that are often communities of color that are experiencing renewable energy in a completely different way that I, as a developer, am coming into this partnership. And it's really important for me as a white female coming in with this idea of, I am going to engage the community. I have planned our community workshop down to the minute, down to the Post-it note. Like, this is how people are going to love to give me design input. And then being able to be humble and open to community not engaging with me in the way that I thought that they were going to, and the way that, I thought it would be fun to do Play-Doh and Post-it notes. And instead, now we're having a roundtable discussion, and really fruitful things are coming out of it, but it's in a totally different way. And I need to continually remind myself that that's okay, that I'm learning how to be a developer, and I'm learning how to engage in community in the way that that works for that community. And it's different in every location that we work with, but gotta be open to that as a developer for sure.
I wonder if you could also speak, Ali, about, we talked earlier and Alvaro gave us kind of that snippet of perfectionism being the tool of white supremacy, and really thinking about white supremacy as a concept and not necessarily that like the problem is white people, but understanding how that idea has kind of infiltrated into the ways our systems have developed. And so I know you shared some of your learning experiences and even some of your projects in putting forward information and the manner in which you were asked to do that. If you could share some of those experiences to help us better understand how this ideal has infiltrated our systems and has remained for quite some time.
Yeah. As I mentioned, I'm new to this this role as developer. So as I'm going along and partnering with neighborhoods to propose these projects, I submitted my first bid for a community solar project to a utility this spring, and I felt, under this policy, there were many different requirements for how I had to engage with communities and have an interconnection requirement and have engineering diagrams. And I spent a lot of time figuring out what that checklist is, how to check it out, submitted the document, and then a month later received notification that that bid was not selected based on kind of a pretty small verbiage that I didn't quite meet the mark, and that felt like a system structure as a whole that is going to be really hard to penetrate and create these sort of dynamic, community-engaged projects that are organic, like how me spending my full time understanding that checklist and how to be perfect and still missing one word in there, how were we going to create some more flexible situations for more meaningful projects to reach fruition.
Awesome. I appreciate you sharing that experience. Encourage you to stick with it, even when small changes kind of thwart you. I encourage you to keep going. One of the things that our opening speaker, Scott CEO, spoke about was working deeply in communities to receive information from the communities to inform the RFP. And so hopefully, to the extent that those conversations can better inform what goes out from the utility scale in terms of what they're asking developers to do. Hopefully that could be better informed by community desires. But then also to the idea of how our processes are developed, hopefully having some understanding where nuance like what you experienced, Ali, isn't the thing that takes a project out of commission before it's even able to start. So we have a little bit more time. We have just under 10 minutes to talk about some ways in which we develop successfully in communities and how we develop with communities, again, not just for them. And so, Ali, I know Shake Energy has a cool way of describing success. So if you can share with us what you mean when you say successful planning in communities.
Yes, so success for us is, we define it as emotional and financial ownership over this project that we co-create together. So Shake Energy Collaborative is hopefully this sort of mechanism for building out a project that is both designed and owned by the community, the residents that live around that project. And so we're working hard. I have a team of interns just in the other room over there who are conducting interviews this summer to really try and understand how are we being successful or not successful in creating that sense of emotional ownership. How are we co-creating so that when the project exists for the next 20 years, it's not the thing that Shake Energy came in and plopped in, but this is a community asset that we own and manage and is dynamic to our needs and meets multiple needs, not just money and electricity, but that there was the design and participation in there. I'll stop there because I'm rambling.
Thanks, Sally. Alvaro, I know some of the projects you've been able to participate in have had that layered effect where maybe the initial entry point was a specific utility or need, but because of the way in which you engage with the community, the result was able to be more robust and lasting. So could you share some of those experiences with us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, before sharing the concrete example, I just wanted to share that most of the time when people think about the work that I do, they think about it as me trying to insert equity into a process. The way that I think about my work is that I'm trying to transform the organization of institutions in order to create barriers for racism and for bureaucracy to undo its racist past. I'm thinking about the whole institution, not just about the one process, because I think it's the institution that either reinforces inequities or is working towards addressing them. So in the example that you were providing, we worked with investor-owned utilities here in California who were starting to make investments in charging infrastructure and contributing to vehicle electrification. And they wanted to find partners in communities where they can provide resources to advance those goals. One of the partners that we connected them with was a program in Huron, California, a tiny little rural town off of Bakersfield, in which they had a car sharing program that was currently operating using, gas vehicles to connect people to mostly hospital visits in Fresno, which is about 45 minutes away, but like 3 hours by bus round trip. So they had an aspiration of turning this Green Raiteros program, that's the name of the program, into a cleaner version of the program using electric vehicles. However, they didn't have the resources to purchase the vehicles or to purchase charging infrastructure. So we connected them with the program that the utility was funding, and we helped the community group design the program and overcome all of those bureaucratic barriers that would have made it impossible for that community to pursue the resources on their own. We really had to work with the utility and our partners in overcoming insurance questions, permitting questions, and kind of business plan, like just a basic business plan for the enterprise. All of these things create one after another barrier that if we don't work towards addressing them, it'll take so many, it'll take so much to go one by one. So those practices that we overcame in that instance, we are trying to replicate and package in policymaking so that institutionally we begin to address these barriers, not one-on-one in each individual case, because it's really the practices of the institution that either will maintain the status quo for a really long time or will be actively working towards changing that process in order to make it easier for impacted communities to, on their own, participate in these processes and ultimately be able to benefit from clean energy projects.
I love that you mentioned that institutional component of maintaining the status quo. I found this quote, and it's: "The concept of progress must be grounded in the idea of catastrophe, that things are status quo is the catastrophe." And so I think as we think about institutions, and often those institutions being places where the status quo is maintained, I can remember early on in the Black Lives Matter movement, a colleague of mine had come to me and had shared that she was kind of shaken. She's in a mixed race relationship and she is white. And she kind of went to work the next day and looked around at her workplace and was kind of like, where am I? Like, who am I working for? What are my colleagues? And kind of just realized the homogeny that she had never really acknowledged before. And so when you talk about institutions and changing the status quo, and if the status quo is the catastrophe, like how do we acknowledge that and then move out of that?
Yep. This is the work that we're in now. In some ways, it's great that we are not having to fight so much on the equity side. More and more people are acknowledging that we need to address the inequities in our society and that they're committing to equity. And I mean, we've seen so many very flowery, very beautifully put together messages of late around committing to Black lives, committing to racial justice and racial equity. And that's great, but that's only the start. And actually, that's kind of the easy thing to do, just to commit, to say, we're going to try to do something. It's doing it. That's the hard part. And that's the part that we need to focus on now. So really articulating what are the specific actions that the institution and its players going to commit to do over the course of the future to be able to address those inequities that have been built into the bureaucracy, into the system. So we are focusing a lot of our time now on providing guidance and recommendations around what are the specific things that you need to do in your mission, values, and goals, in your planning processes, in your implementation processes, and then your evaluation and analysis processes to advance equity approaches. And I think it's those specifics that are going to be really important to be able to pave the way towards doing the work in a much better way and with equity at the core. And we are no longer accepting of the fact that equity is something that you do as an add-on, something that you do as one part of the approach. It has to be the approach. Equity has to be front and center. And if it isn't, frankly, it's just equity washing. You're saying that you want to do equity, but you're not really going to do it because it's basically a broken promise. So the specifics really, really matter.
Yeah, I appreciate you ending on that note with clarity about equity washing. I'm used to hearing greenwashing. Equity washing is a new term, but I'll add to my repository of terms. So thank you for that. We have a bit of time to turn to the audience questions, and got a couple questions coming in. I see one. How can we reduce barriers to residential solar? Net metering was removed years ago. Tax incentives are disappearing. People are afraid of the permitting process because of some of the non-permitted construction that is common in Hawaii. I don't know if that's a particular community-focused question, but if either of you would like to give a go at it, I welcome you to.
This is extrapolating a little bit out of that and inserting the community word into there, but I think a lot of the motivation behind community scale energy is looking at maybe the shortcomings of residential solar policies and also the cost on an individual basis of residential. And I find that both the cost sharing mechanism of creating, a community scale project that maybe has more economies of scale actually resonates a lot with the individual community members and organizations that we're talking about. So looking more towards community scale projects where words like sharing, co-ownership, I think that for me, that's where I'm putting my focus is let's put residential aside. Let's look at how do we pull together our resources, pull together our creative capital, and build a shared project that fits the needs of the community.
Awesome, thanks, Allie. There's another question. What are you folks doing with the community colleges and technical colleges to train a workforce and promote small business opportunities? Alvaro, do you want to give that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously these entities they play such an important role and they have to be part of the conversation. But what we've seen is that, one, we need to have a strategy, and this has to be a just transition strategy in order to think about the workforce development aspect of renewable energy. What are going to be the jobs that are going to be phasing out that are eligible and kind of applicable to a renewable energy environment? What are the kinds of education and training that we need to introduce into high schools, into colleges and universities to be able to develop the new workforce? And where do we anticipate the uptick in renewable energy projects? Actually, kind of what kinds of industries is it creating? So to me, the proposition is a much broader, much bigger one in terms of how are we working with the ecosystem of work to be able to pave that, that path. And community colleges, small business associations, workforce development organizations, they play such an incredibly critical role, but it can't just be, again, a siloed approach. It really has to be comprehensive, in my opinion, to take root. So some of that is happening already. California has some plans where it's trying to create that kind of infrastructure. But I'll point to Colorado actually is one of the first places that I've seen anyway, that has a statewide office of just transition. It's a just transition office. And their role is to be able to develop this comprehensive plan. And I think that's kind of the thing that we need to be working on more.
Awesome, thank you. We are in the time, well, we're not in the end of the time, we are at the end of our time rather. And I want to thank you both for sharing your time with us, for sharing your thoughts, your hearts, and just for the work that you've done to be able to bring you to this point. I encourage you to continue to do the work, and just grateful for both of you. And thank you, audience, for paying attention, for engaging, and for letting us share with you. Mahalo. Aloha.
Okay, Doug, get us started.
All right. Well, welcome back from that break. The break sure felt longer when we did the live event. I've got to say that. We're going to go ahead and do another poll. So this one is going to be focused on national issues. And we're going to give you, again, a list of 5 topics. And they're all things that people have talked about. But our question to you is, which of these should be talked about more by people that are knowledgeable about energy? So, Frank, I think we've got a list of 5. And can you run through those?
Okay, so the proper role of nuclear in our energy future.
This gets you back to a tension, perhaps, between climate and some of the other goals. Here in Hawaii, we have a constitutional provision, but in many of the other states, there's really an argument. If you look at climate, and this is a zero carbon emitting approach, does it deserve more attention? So, that, and specifically this SMR program, we're asking, does it deserve more attention?
Okay, our next one is the impact of electrification and gas bans.
Right, and so I think a lot of people have noticed that there have been a number of bans for new construction. These are generally natural gas bans, and they usually have to do with hot water heating so far. But that does seem to be a trend, and it's the flip side of the trend that we wanted to discuss in the original March program, and that has to do with electrification of the grid. As the grid gets greener, are there other social benefits that come from increasing the percentage of renewables on the grid? So anyway, that's the kind of the question here, is looking at that and saying, are we paying enough attention to this as a trend?
Okay, so the next one, and it's been a subject of discussion locally as well as nationally, renewable natural gas is a viable alternative to electrify everything.
This is an interesting one, isn't it? Because, when people come up with objections to natural gas, they're focused on the fact that it's a fossil fuel and it's got these carbon impacts, carbon monoxide impacts, all sorts of things when you combust it. So we're going back and we're asking, is this renewable natural gas really a viable product if you were to think of it at scale? In other words, is this kind of a novelty thing where you could replace a small amount of the current natural gas, or is this really a viable thing? And, I think people are questioning, are we going out of our way just so we can reuse some existing infrastructure rather than coming up with a solution we really want? So anyway, I think that's the question there.
And the fourth is batteries are not the solution to everything.
Well, this should be controversial, because clearly in Hawaii and a lot of the states, we've already moved to make batteries a key portion of the utility scale projects, and most of these are based on some variation of lithium ion chemistry. And in terms of life cycle, in terms of cost, in terms of safety risks, there are a lot of legitimate questions people have. And there's maybe a misunderstanding in the general public that they're used to a battery in their phone, and a battery on the grid is not a net generator of power. People just need to understand it is a net user of power. So those are the arguments on that one.
And the final one is always 10 years away. Hydrogen is finally having its moment in the sun.
Absolutely. So we mentioned the company Nikola there, and I think our audience is pretty savvy. You all probably know that was Tesla's first name, and that this company is mounting really a direct challenge to Tesla, and particularly the Tesla Semi product. So this is the question, like you hinted at, Frank. Is hydrogen always the fuel of tomorrow? Or is something really different this time? And it does seem like people are identifying particular markets, on the commercial trucks in the US, and also the Chinese government, seems to be taking a really active role. So is this either the year or a major year for hydrogen? That's the question.
Okay, we're watching the votes come in. What do you think, Doug?
I don't know. What do you see as the leader here?
So far, batteries are not the solution to everything, and hydrogen is finally having its moment in the sun. But interesting enough, nuclear energy is not doing too badly.
Yeah, no, it really is interesting, and I think we have a pretty sophisticated audience, and that's nice. And I'm glad, that people are seeing some of these issues. The battery one, really, again, being in Hawaii, I mean, we have moved very quickly to batteries that are 20, 30, 40 million dollar test systems. And, you know, it's important for us all to just understand what are the limits. So, yeah, that is an interesting observation by the audience.
Yeah, this is very evenly divided. Interesting.
Very interesting, yeah. But I don't see a lot of excitement so much on the gas fan, so.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much for participating in our poll. Doug, would you like to introduce the next panel?
Yeah, I would. I think a lot of people, if this is your first time to the conference, you might be wondering, why is there someone from the city of Boulder on this panel? And if you've been here before, if you participated over the years, you probably already know the answer. Jonathan has been a huge contributor to our conference for years. Been here since the very first year. And I'm really interested because every year he comes together with a group of people that have a national focus, but allow us in Hawaii to really interact and contribute and also, learn. So I really don't have any further thoughts other than I'm very pleased to welcome back Jonathan Cohen, and I'm very interested to hear from his
brain
panel
trust.
Absolutely.
Okay, I think we're going to get rolling. So good morning, afternoon, evening, or I guess I would say whatever's appropriate for all of you. My name is Jonathan Cohen. I am the Chief Sustainability and Resilience Officer for the City of Boulder, Colorado. So I have to say it's really been a terrific series of conversations so far today. And I really want to thank MEBD and Maui County. I want to thank my colleagues on the steering committee and, of course, all of today's panelists. And all of you sitting at your computers, wherever you happen to be. So I really want to jump in, given that we have a limited amount of time. I'm actually really excited about this last panel. I have been following the work of these three amazing people for quite a while, and I'm really eager to introduce you all to them. I'm not going to read their bios. You can look at their names and look up their information on the program, but you really should. Joining us, of course, is Kathryn Wright, who's a program director for building energy at the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, Carlos Martin, who's a senior fellow at the Urban Institute, and Destiny Knock, the assistant professor of engineering public policy at Carnegie Mellon University. So we can cue the virtual applause. I would say if there is a clear message, at least for me, that's emerged from today's sessions, it's that really, to reach our clean energy goals, we really have to build and support solutions that truly include everyone. And if nothing else, 2020 for me has been a year of regaining perspective. So there's a silver lining of hard times like these that inspire introspection and focus. What matters the most to us, and how do we live up to that? And I think, at least as I've heard today, there's a resonance in being bold right now, and there's a determination to not go back to normal. So there's been quite a bit of discussion about building back better. So what I want to start with in our conversation is a bit of level setting. And I would say, despite the energy opportunities we've seen emerging, many, in my opinion, are being left out. As I've thought about the need to design a socially equitable and resilient energy system and have an economy that's really built to last, our current approach really isn't built to include everyone. So my first question to you all is, do I have that right? As experts in this area, do you also see inequities in our current system? And Destiny, you lead the Energy Equity and Sustainability Group at Carnegie Mellon, and much of your research has really been at this macro level, particularly as it relates specifically to the point of designing resilient and equitable energy systems. So I want to turn to you first to kind of kick this off and give your reflections around that question. Do you see inequities in our current system?
Yeah, so thanks, John. Some of the big inequities that I have been seeing in my research are, one, where people live really determines how our dependence on energy is like trickling down to their health impacts. So, low-income communities are more likely to live near coal power plants because the land is cheaper out there. They're also less likely to be able to adopt solar technologies. So, a lot of low-income communities are renter populations, and so that leads them to not be able to invest in that long-term changes to the structure of their home A lot of communities that live in these high-rise apartment complexes also have limitations on the access to renewable technologies. So there's a lot of inequities there. And then, of course, we have job inequities. So even if you are living near these power plants, you might not have access to some of those jobs there due to lack of public transportation to those plants. And so when we're thinking about energy transition, one of the things that we hear a lot of talk about is not wanting to lose jobs in the energy sector. But one of the things that we're kind of thinking about in my group is how can we make sure that communities that haven't previously had access to those jobs gain some access. So making sure that when we're moving forward in energy transition, there's more access to renewable technologies, jobs, and less kind of implications of this pollution.
Carlos, so I just want to maybe kind of get your reflections. You know, in the work that you're doing, you do a lot of research. Obviously, do you agree with Destiny? Do you see anything that she's missed? I'm curious.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, to answer your question, Jonathan, yes, of course, we see continuing inequity. I think most people in this country, and ideally most of this audience, has acknowledged that throughout this day. But I must say, I got very excited when Destiny started talking about housing and residential segregation, the history of the legacies of those folks. We did not plan this, because that's exactly one of the core ways in which I measure inequity, particularly in energy performance. And we still have, just look at the numbers right now. We have 6 million people who still require light heat in this country, plus the additional 1.7 that were given access to light heat through the CARES Act. And that's just a fraction of the people who need that. I mean, there are so many ways in which housing and access to good quality housing has factored into energy equity that I think it's important to realize that multiple layer of complication when we talk about energy equity. And so thinking about an energy intervention on its own is not necessarily going to get you everywhere you want to go. So just to add real quickly to Destiny before we pass it to Kathryn, is that, I mean, they're looking at the amount of severely or moderately inadequate housing in this country. There are clear disparities right there. 5.2% of US homes are severely or moderately inadequate, which is kind of a staggering number if you think about it. 5% of our homes don't meet basic functional operational needs of contemporary life. But clearly, when you're looking at low-income renters, for example, folks that make under $40,000 a year, that goes up to 9.2% of just that community is living in inadequate housing. When you look by race, 8.6% of Native households and 7.2% of African-American households live in inadequate housing, and that's twice the rate of white households. So there are numerous ways in which housing is a key vehicle. I mean, we could talk about jobs, we could talk about a lot of other interesting overlays, and I think we should. But for me, a lot of the core issues are the history of housing, the quality of that housing based on long-term disinvestments, and segregation patterns that have led to that perpetuation of that quality.
Carlos, it's really interesting. I appreciate your perspective on this, because I think it's not a dimension. The issue of housing in particular is not a dimension that we normally think of in terms of energy inequity. We think of kind of utilities as monolithic and services that they provide, and is it really just around rates and affordability? And so you're bringing another dimension into this that I think is really interesting. Kathryn, I'd love to get your thoughts on this too. Do you agree? Do you see something else that Destiny and Carlos have not mentioned yet?
Yes, I certainly agree with the points that they both made. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, it's about 200 cities and counties across the US and Canada, including 4 in Hawaii, who are all working on the climate and energy transition. And one of the pieces of research and the questions that we've gotten is, how is COVID-19 making some of these inequities that we've noticed in the energy system worse? And so one thing that we have sort of noticed is the relationship now with energy burden. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, it just means how much of your household income is going towards paying for your utility bills. And right now it's shown that about a quarter of Black and Hispanic families don't have emergency funds, which is creating a lot of additional financial distress. And with extreme heat season now, we're seeing also that a lot of residential energy use has gone up. The rate in Austin, Texas was 17% of energy demand. Now that we're sheltering in place at home, in many cases during the summer for the pandemic, in Hawaiian electric territory, it's about the same 13% increase in residential demand. So you're seeing additional energy burdens placed by the pandemic on these same communities that were already experiencing inequity. And in some of the worst areas of the country for energy burden, that's about 30%. That was 30% of income going towards utility bills even before there was a pandemic. So we're really facing a pretty intense challenge here. Some of our member cities have really started trying to attack this because they realize that even with some of the support that's been given towards moratoriums on disconnections, that it simply isn't enough to help people get through the process of sheltering in place and also sheltering in place during extreme heat. So they've procured air conditioning units. The utility there has doubled the amount of their low-income bill credit, sort of recognizing that even if people have access to cooling, they may be afraid to turn their air conditioning on and create a situation where there's good occupant comfort simply because of the affordability challenge that they're being placed under. So I would certainly agree with everything that Carlos and Destiny said, but definitely sort of lift up that there are some unique challenges we're facing now that are exacerbating a lot of the issues that were in our system.
Thanks, Kathryn. And you kind of raise a point for me in terms of kind of situational inequities too. I think what we've experienced and what we're seeing in Hawaii is very, very transferable to what we're seeing in the mainland in many ways, but some things are very specific to areas. Your example about air conditioning, I think, is a really good one. So let me, Kathryn, I'm gonna pick on you just a little bit and maybe ask you this question. So if I can paraphrase at least what I think I've heard, it would make some sense for us to think about using social values in addition to kind of least cost as a value or as a metric. So is it simple as designing the right policies, meaning its policies enable communities, particularly communities of color, to develop local renewable energy generation or energy efficiency programs, and that helps produce, as we know, healthier neighborhoods, reduces the energy burden that you're describing, creates good jobs, build a local economy, et cetera. So you were the lead author on a really great report called A Framework for an Equitable Energy Supply Transformation. And that's why I wanted to ask you this question. Do you agree that it's as simple as getting the policies right?
I think it's much more complicated than that. In addition to the research, we've been doing work with 11 cities across the country through our Zero Cities project, the point of which was trying to center equity as well as decarbonization in the built environment. And one thing that we learned is it's really important to put community at the very beginning of that process and really make sure that any policies that cities are coming up with or counties or state governments are coming up with are really grounded in lived experience. So I can give an example. So for example, often what cities will do is they'll have a rough draft of a policy, and community engagement has traditionally looked like trying to get feedback on that rough draft. Some of the communities that are in our Zero Cities program have thrown that out the window. They actually went to the communities with a blank slate. We're focusing on what it means to transform the built environment. They spent a lot of time, almost a year, on capacity building and making sure that a lot of the neighborhood-based organizations and the residents sort of understood what the core issues were so that they were able to empower and lift up their own priorities so that the city could have responsive policy making. So what does that do? That creates an engaged and politically active realm of public support when you're actually ready to pass a policy. In one case, one of the cities in our project actually did a complete turnaround. They had a policy they were thinking about for performance standards for large buildings in their community. And after talking to residents for a year, they realized that there was a serious problem with substandard conditions in rental housing. And so it really changed their priorities. And so now that they're going to address that, I'm happy to say that that's the city of Portland. They're pretty public about this now. So I would say any good policy really has to start with community at the beginning, and it does involve a level of power sharing and power shifting that has not traditionally been a part of policymaking or community engagement processes.
Interesting. Carlos, I see you nodding your head. Destiny, same question. Do you agree with that?
Was that to me or Carlos? I'm sorry.
To you, Destiny. I'm sorry.
Okay. So I do agree with that. One of the things that I'm building a lot of mathematical models in my research. And one of the things that we like to think about are what are the trade-offs for different investments. And so a part of that is really going into the community or talking with stakeholders about what do you really want at the end of the day. So you can have a policy that says, let's deploy a lot of renewables, but renewables is a tool for something, right? And so sometimes it's about taking a step back and thinking about like, what is our real goal here? So just, we talked about a lot of like CO2 reduction. We talked about like energy burden reduction, the need for more jobs. And so no matter what we invest in the energy sector, there's going to be these trade-offs. And a lot of times we have this like focus on a single best solution, right? We want that best solution that's going to solve all of our problems. And really, like, my work is more focused on the trade-off analysis. So I think that, when we kind of are moving forward, we need to think about the trade-offs that we're seeing between different systems. So if we have a high wind like situation versus one where there's a mix of wind, solar, and natural gas, like what are the jobs that we're trading off? What are the costs that we're trading off? What CO2 emissions are we trading off? And are one of these systems actually going to get us to where we want to be? And to do that, we really have to step back and kind of get like a deep understanding about stakeholder objectives and where we are going to agree and disagree. And then when we understand where our disagreements are and the trade-offs that we're getting, that also helps us plan for like the winners and losers of energy transition, right? And so then that helps you look at this multifaceted energy transition discussion so that then you can try to like preemptively plan for some of these problems or challenges that might arise, which will then, I think, help the transition go more smoothly.
I'm just going to add very quickly that,
Yeah, please.
I mean, that's exactly right. It's about trade-offs. The trade-offs, as you mentioned, and when you're talking about winners and losers, there are people who in power and politics and money that are associated with some of these transitions. And so when you're talking about trade-offs, it's important to think about who actually are the winners and losers in that process.
Well, Carlos, let me pick up on that. As we think about this transition to a more resilient energy system, how do we measure that? Because I think the concept of winners and losers is really important. And, I've heard some suggest that this is really like a just transition narrative, and we should be using metrics like the jobs and economic development impact models. Personally, I think that really misses the social dimensions that are truly supportive of equity concerns. You have, I think, spent a lot of time putting together publications on this topic. One, and in fact, I was really intrigued with from last year, was really looking at the current state of measuring equity. So what are your thoughts on how do you track progress?
I want to follow up on what Destiny said. It's really about what the end outcome is supposed to be. And then how do you align everything towards that process? So, I mean, your critique of JEDA, of the jobs and economic development impact models are warranted because they don't they don't include all aspects of social implications, social outcomes that address real equity issues in this country. They also don't necessarily measure some of the things that we actually think are important when it comes to equity. Overall jobs are important. So there are good important steps that we're going forwards with. So the paper I think you're mentioning is a paper that we did on very exploratory paper about how do we look at a variety of dimensions. So again, the idea is that you're taking multiple prongs at this that I co-wrote with Jamal Lewis at Green Healthy Homes Initiative. And there we looked at 6 dimensions, starting with very qualitative one, like understanding the historical legacies of disparities. For example, the placement of a hydroelectric dam or a coal facility in somebody's community on a tribal sacred lands, etc. So there's very sort of preliminary reasons why people have a sense of perception of inequity as much as realized inequities. Then going through all of the things that we've talked about, like measuring jobs, how many people are employed by different sectors, how many people are actually not just getting jobs, but also employed at the leadership levels of these organizations and making actual decisions and on the boards of these organizations. I'm always intrigued by the fact that there's always sort of the sense that jobs are sort of the first move towards equity. I had a great conversation with somebody who one of the big proponents of the Green New Deal and focused on the public housing aspects of the Green New Deal. And part of those proposals included making sure that it's something like 85%, I'm forgetting the exact number, of jobs held in doing renewable energy installations and energy efficiency retrofits in public housing should go to the residents. And I made sure that he knew that, well, 50% of the residents of public housing in the United States today are elderly or disabled. So, and I'm guessing some of the 48% don't actually want to work in construction in the other group. So it's really looking not about energy jobs. Energy jobs are certainly part of the story, but it's also about energy options and then what you want to actually see in terms of long-term social and economic outcomes. So I didn't go through the other measures of equity because I'm more interested in hearing what my co-panelists say. But certainly that's something that I want people to think about, that it's helpful to define the activity that you want to get and then start going backwards into these layers of potential measurement.
I think that's super helpful. What I want to suggest, if this is okay with the three of you, I'm tracking some Q&A in the chat, and there's some really good stuff here that I think we would really value from hearing your thoughts on. Would it be okay if we just kind of went into Q&A at this point?
Sounds good.
Sure.
Okay, great. So I'm going to start with the first one. And I don't know if you can read this. I'm going to read it out loud for those of you that maybe aren't reading. It says, could many of these inequities that we've been discussing be minimized or resolved by incentivizing or encouraging more public-private partnerships that include the voice of the community residents in creating, implementing, and sustaining clean energy tech in that localized area? I think there's a lot of great examples of how certain cities are kind of building up these task forces or looking at climate justice plans. But, what are the pros and cons of that approach? I'm curious to... And I will let you all decide who wants to jump in on that one, or I can call on you. Kathryn looks like she wants to speak.
Yeah, I can start. I certainly think that public-private partnerships are certainly a pathway, certainly for pilots, but I think we have to start talking about policies when we're talking about scaling, because I think that there are often sometimes unique situations where there really is a well-situated private partner, but that's certainly not the case all across the country. I also think in public-private partnerships, particularly when community is involved, you have to have that same type of conversation that I referred to about sort of power sharing. Even if it's a collaborative project, you really have to sort of recognize the dynamics that are part of that process. And sometimes policy and processes that are hosted by the cities can mitigate that somewhat. So I certainly see it as a pathway and certainly for scaling up some of the technology solutions, but for widespread and touching large parts of the population, I sort of see that there is a role that policy has to play eventually to move past some of the small scale one-off PPPs.
I see both Carlos and Destiny nodding. Carlos, do you have a little bit to add?
Yeah, I mean, there were two components to that question. One was on community engagement within the partnerships, and I would think we could all argue, everybody on this panel would argue that the community engagement and inclusion is a necessary component of any intervention, regardless of who is the stakeholder manager. When it comes to PPPs, I mean, I'm not adverse to PPPs, but the reality is so many of the equity questions that we have will not be resolved by basic market functions, right? There's a cost to doing good community engagement that it may not necessarily be reflected in some of what we're looking at, unless there are price differentials on the market. So it's important to realize what the benefits of public-private partnerships could be, and then looking at, well, what the additional costs are to actually overcome some of the challenges that we're identifying at the beginning of the panel.
And just building on what Carlos and Kathryn have said, so some of the things that so I kind of go back to like, what do we want, right? And if I'm thinking about energy burden, then some people in low-income communities still might not be able to take advantage of these like public-private partnerships. And so when I'm thinking about these communities, I always want to make sure that, as we're transitioning this energy grid, like one thing that they really care about is not having their energy burden increase, right? Not having their costs go up. And so as people are shifting more to like solar and wind, and they're kind of jumping on and off the grid at the residential level, somebody has to still pay for the reliability. Somebody still has to pay for the poles and wires. And right now, our actual pricing mechanism for that is just based on how many electrons you use. But it's not actually, the poles and wires don't change no matter how much electricity you use, right? Somebody still has to pay for them. And so we want to make sure that we're not transferring that burden of paying for just the infrastructure side only to those that do not have the ability to jump off the grid as well.
And I think that is a really fair and relevant conversation to what's going on in Hawaii and what has been going on in Hawaii. And I think it's been front and center for quite a while. I think we actually could learn a lot from the experience on the islands in terms of how they're working to solve some of that. With the time we have, I want to hit this last question, and buckle up. It's a good one. So here's the question. Are residential energy costs included in HUD's evaluation of housing affordability calculation, or would that even be helpful? And the questioner says, I'm familiar with the movement in the transportation sector to evaluate more comprehensive HH affordability based on the Housing and Transportation Affordability Index, which was a collaboration of HUD, EPA, and DOT. So anybody jump in to answer that? Carlos, I think that, do you have a thought?
I'm happy to answer. I mean, in typical federal government the definitions of the affordability rates, that utilities are included. So it's a quick answer to that question.
No, that's great.
Yeah. So I mean, and I think that's part of the challenge is that's because it assumed those definitions and those metrics were developed at a very early time when there was cheap fossil fuel fueling most of the country. And so the reality is that utility burden is increasing, especially for low-income households. And the ways that we think about all of the costs that are associated with maintaining a household today in the United States, and particularly the disparate burdens for those that are sort of equally rated, such that it becomes a bigger portion of a lower income household's bag of goods, we have to explore a bit more. So alternatives like those that account for transportation as well as energy and other increasing costs are important.
Great. Well, as these things happen, we just got the engine running on this conversation, and we now need to wrap it up. First of all, Kathryn, Carlos, Destiny, I am so grateful for your time. I'm so grateful to be able to speak with you in person. I will continue to watch your amazing work from afar. Hopefully we can do this in person sometime soon. Doug, I will kick it back to you.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you to all the panelists. That was really interesting. I'm just sitting here thinking it's rare to get people that are both so savvy on policy and willing to be practical and talk about economic cost. And, you know, at a time like this, you know, keeping in mind the economic burden, I mean, that's one of the topics that we heard from the very beginning of the day and have heard repeated throughout the day. So thank you very much for being so practical with us. Frank?
Well, we're at that time. We're closing, and we'd like to thank all the sponsors and participants who have joined us today. I guess after 12 o'clock, I guess we can have a cocktail now, right? It's 6 o'clock somewhere in the world. But I want to thank especially the sponsors who, as Leslie said, have stuck with us throughout, you know, this issue of the pandemic. And it's been tough on the bottom lines for a lot of these organizations. And we're very grateful for their support. Doug, I also like to pan over and to show mission control here. We'd like to thank and say a special mahalo to all our staff here. Oh yes, there they are. They kept me honest. They kept you honest, Doug. So yeah, definitely. It's awesome.
Absolutely. Thank you to all the staff. And
let them wave. Come on, stand up, guys. Let's see your faces. There we go. A big hand. If you're sitting wherever you're at, that's a big hand for all of them. Awesome.
So as a final note to our audience, we just wanted to say thank you. So whatever that is where you live, whether it's domo arigato, shei, merci, or just thank you, gracias. Yes. We appreciate your time. We appreciate you joining us. And we hope it'll interest you in coming back when we do either a live or hybrid event next for the Hawaii Energy Conference.
Thank you very much. Aloha oi, which means until we meet again, right? Farewell to thee, but we will meet again, and hopefully in better circumstances. Aloha.
Aloha.